Thanks everyone for joining. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining. We'll get started in just a couple seconds here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this morning or afternoon, depending on where you happen to be in the world, Building a Culture of Experimentation. Before we get started, a couple housekeeping items today. This session will be recorded and emailed out to each of you after the session. So please feel free to revisit the content or share it with any of your colleagues. We also have a time carved out to address any questions that you may have during the session. So please use the Q&A box within Zoom, and we will get to those questions at the end of the session here. In terms of your speakers, my name is Phil Birch. I'm a group product marketing manager here at Amplitude for the Amplitude Experiment product. Very pleased today to introduce our key speaker, Saleem Malkana, executive in residence at Reforge. Saleem, please introduce yourself to our guests this morning.
Hey everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's really good to meet you all today. As Phil mentioned, I'm an executive in residence at Reforge, which means that if you're familiar with Reforge and its kind of career development and upskilling work, as an EIR, I help kind of translate some of that academic work to the real world. I leverage my experience, including almost now 20 years of experience in product and growth, to help kind of make these lessons resonate in product strategy, product leadership, growth, things like that. And I get to make some case studies and things like that along the way. It's kind of been a good business school professor / podcast host role over the last year. And then in addition, I've been, developing my advisory services on these topics of product and growth. And most recently, I've been geeking out. I feel like an AI hipster, all the things that have been happening in the last year or so. I feel like everyone knows the band that I've been following. So I work a lot on generative AI and AI transformation, really all things transforming for teams. So I'm excited to talk about the transformation of experimentation today.
Awesome. Yeah, we're really glad you're joining us today to really dig into what it means to build that culture of experimentation and what does good look like.
Absolutely.
So here's a few things that we're going to discuss today. Like I said, we'll also save time for questions at the end. So as these come up, again, use that Q&A box within Zoom, and we will get those addressed in due course. Now, before we get into what a culture of experimentation actually means, feels like, let's start by contrasting that a little bit with cultures that are obsessed with just shipping quickly and how that can actually develop a culture of the feature factory. So Saleem, tell me, do you have any professional experience where you worked in this type of feature factory, and what was the impact of that culture on that organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've all been there at one point or another. That's probably why a lot of people are on this call today. I have definitely faced this in at least one startup that I was a part of. Two big examples kind of really come to mind here. I was leading a small product and design team at the time. and working with my partners across kind of like marketing, engineering, and a few business teams as well. And we had these monthly goals that I think were pretty specific. So I think for my product team, which was about 4 of us, there were about 16 or 18 goals per month of like what we're doing, depending on the part of the product lifecycle. So what is happening in product requirements world, what is happening in design, what is being worked on in engineering. And that is separate than the engineering part of the goal. So when you have more goals than business days, that is kind of tells you that you're really thinking really granularly about what are we building? We are a factory, we need to ship. And then a second part of this, as I remember, and this was kind of like part of this like wartime footing of being able to say like we need to operate, we need to ship right now. Management had this idea to have like weekly reporting from each person as it bubbles up. So like what is each PM or designer, what are their weekly goals? How does that go into kind of Saleem's team and his weekly goals? How does that go into everyone's? And that's all kind of sent up the chain. So this is a lot of kind of, you can already see a lot of kind of communications burden here,
Yep.
all to kind of track what exactly are we working on? How quickly are we doing it? What is the output that we're building? And so this is, all well intentioned in the management kind of like philosophy here to say like, can we move faster? But this definitely made it feel like a factory, right? Like how many widgets are you building per day? Can you build one more widget? And this definitely caused some pain that we can definitely talk about.
Yeah. And why do you think so many product organizations view their KPI as just shipping faster or the volume
Yeah.
of releases they ship?
Yeah, I think that like there's a couple of things here. One is, I think management in some situations like these feature factories, management beyond product and engineering can see that squad of product design engineering as responsible for building and shipping, rather than like overall how are we driving impact for the business, how are we growing the business, things like that. So it's about what can I ship to improve, because I'm blocked by product design and engineering. And ultimately, like this can be, I don't want to, psychoanalyze everyone's kind of feature factory situation, but this can be sort of an issue of like, what can I control or what do I have perceived control over? And management may think that like, hey, I have perceived control over what does product and design and engineering work on? What are they building? What are they developing? Are they working on the right thing? I can control that. I can't necessarily control the actual amorphous impact that's happening to my North Star metric or to my other business metrics. So I think that like that's why I really like, especially in the experimentation playbook, I talk about the culture of experimentation, because you can see, while tooling is definitely a part of that because we can help illustrate that impact, it really starts with kind of how are people feeling, what are management's goals, things like that.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So in terms of what some of these characteristics of what life may be like if you're in a feature factory, I'll let you kind of take these one at a time.
Yeah. So we're going to walk through, and if this resonates for anyone on the call, feel free to use the Zoom reactions or tell us if this resonates with you. But this is what I've seen both in my experience as well as in my advising experience, kind of working with a number of teams, both from startups, but actually really in a lot of larger companies who are going through their own kind of like digital transformation or product transformation. So there's this operates on a number of different scales of companies. But number one, I've seen the characteristic that management just knows what to build. And so they're saying, hey, product and engineering, go get it done. You are blocking my growth. You are blocking my outcome. And yeah, as one commenter, Rahul here said, how hard can it be? So at some point, I think I was told launching 3 new countries was plug and play. And I asked the head of engineering, do you want to be plug or do you want to be play? Because like it wasn't so simple. So what does it mean to say like management knows what to build, just get it done? Like they say like the strategy lives in management's heads, or at least they think they know exactly what to go do. They know the right things to build, they know the wrong things to avoid, so they want you to go do it. So this often looks like a laundry list that the product team gets. I need you to go do these 12 things, not the other 5 things that you think are important. That's definitely one characteristic here. And you might see as an extension of that, you don't necessarily see a strategy document. You don't necessarily see a unifying a call to arms here about what is our path in this world and how are we getting there. It's really go do these 12 things.
Yeah.
The second here, we're too busy to test. So what does this look like? This looks like we are in constant phase one work. I don't know if this is something that others have seen, but I've seen this in a number of clients where we're doing a project, we're just going to do phase one, and it's a big phase one. And spoiler alert, you never get to phase two. You never get to phase three. Those are ways to placate other teams. The eye of Sauron, the eye of attention shifts to the next kind of burning problem after that. So constant phase one work is one example here. Tech debt builds because they're too busy to kind of be strategic about it. The team feels burnt out from constant sprinting and feels really stretched thin. This is the idea of like, you are in sprint mode. We're too busy to be thoughtful and experiment. Feature factories often feel like they can't trust their data. So they feel that I'm lacking in the metrics or measurement, that like if I'm going to run an experiment, I know exactly how to say whether it's successful or not, and whether it's worth that extra time to do it. Because in the end, can't trust the data, but I, as management, know exactly what to go build. So there's this kind of vicious cycle of, if I can't trust the data, I'm not going to invest in the tools and the solutions to go build out the data fluency. Next, this decision-making sits outside of product. This is similar to kind of this management knows what to build. Product is really seen as the builder. And this might actually have kind of second order effects where the product team therefore isn't resourced to have enough kind of product managers to think through what is the strategy of what we're building. How do I become a good partner across not only product design and engineering, but to my partners in my other kind of go-to-market and other teams. And with that smaller product team, now you have no mental space for the thinking of the strategy. Now you are truly only kind of building. So this is definitely a characteristic that I've seen.
That's interesting, that the size of the product management team ends up being impacted because, again, their job is to just go complete the list, right? As opposed to think through what needs to be built. That's interesting.
Yeah. And then last, this characteristic that we can't accept failure. And again, like this is always coming from, I think, good intentions. I always want to kind of reinforce that. It's just like that it doesn't get to the right outcome, ironically, here, talking about kind of outcomes versus outputs. But in this case, I've seen, that the team needs to move fast. We need to go do those 12 things. I thought we established earlier in this meeting that you need to go do these 12 things. We can't accept failure and be wrong about the other kind of 4 or 5 things to build. So a lot of times people are saying, like, management has established, we need to go do these things. We can't be wrong about it. And there's not necessarily a curiosity or an acknowledged ambiguity that there are some things that we're going to do that are going to have outsized effect and some things that we're going to do that fail. And that's okay, because failure comes hopefully with learning. Failure without learning, they're called mistakes. Those are bad. We want to avoid those things.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So this really gets us really to the point that shipping a feature is the midpoint of the development process. It's not about just shipping and getting to that output and getting to the next kind of 11 things on the list of 12. It's really about learning from that midpoint, where you learn from every release, you learn from every feature or change that you make to your product. Without that learning and that compounding of learning, you're really just getting through the laundry list. You're really just trying to get through it. And like another spoiler alert here, the laundry lists never end. You never get to the end of the laundry list. There is always more on the list. So it's really important to start to have these learnings that come from shipping that can then compound and grow over time, so that whether you're going in the right direction, or that, like, hey, we shipped something, it didn't have the impact we thought it did, or we saw something surprising in the customer behavior. That's actually going to tell us something new about kind of our customer base, their persona, what their needs and wants are. So that's also still a good thing.
Yeah. So obviously that feature factory doesn't sound like a great way for a product team to operate for a variety of ways, for a variety of reasons, rather. So earlier you shared an example where it went poorly, or you were in a feature factory. Can you provide us some real world examples of when you were truly part of a culture of experimentation and what that felt like?
Yeah, actually, like this will be fun, because in this startup that I was in, I was able to, as head of product, shift us more to the outcome-based squads and thinking about across our business, how do we think about in the life cycle of a customer, the acquisition and growth kind of squad, the engagement and retention squad, and ultimately the platform squad. So by shifting from that feature factory to one of more customer outcomes and business outcomes, I learned a lot. It's been kind of the basis for a lot of my kind of team transformation and business transformation advising. And it led to a lot of like true benefits for this business, which I'm happy to kind of to chat about, how this example went, and then we can get
Yeah,
into
please.
kind of making that change more generally.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. What types of outcomes, once the culture was shifted, did this ultimately drive?
Yeah. Ultimately this business grew phenomenally. We were able to kind of, this was a subscription business. We were able to kind of first build 0 to 1, then we were scaling in our ARR. So we were able to tackle some critical churn issues, scale ARR from 0 to $50 million, and kind of like establish some very healthy product growth and other practices that I've adopted later in my career and also in my advising. Now, I will say there is a midpoint here where magical business growth didn't happen overnight, but what happened by
Sure.
thinking about these outcomes, by thinking about what we're trying to solve and how we're going to go do it, meant that we were actually much more nimble when challenges came up. When we actually had a rising churn problem, we weren't just like, okay, well, we have a laundry list of 10 things, where does this fit on the list, what are we displacing? We're able to say, who owns this overall outcome, what is happening here, how do we dissect this and unpack it, so that we can understand what needs to shift on our priorities, or what do we not understand, because there was clearly some things that we didn't understand here. We had a complete dumpster fire of a churn problem at one point, and we were able to kind of create a squad that attacked that made the experience much more sticky, much more engaging, and by knowing their outcome of engagement and retention, by leveraging, again, another spoiler alert, Amplitude analytics, actually in this case, we were able to kind of understand the product behavior, the customer behavior that led to better engagement, that led to better retention, that drove down our churn. So this was a very logical step between thinking about the outcomes and driving healthy ones, not magic.
Yeah, it seems like in this example, there's a lot more collaboration, right? When you're centered around one
That's
business
right.
goal as opposed to 5 squads having a list of 15 things to do.
That's totally right. So like when I talk about squads, when I talk about establishing squads, I think those are by definition cross-functional, right? So this is
Sure.
not
Yep.
just product and engineering in a trench being like, go
Right.
move forward on here, right? This is about how are we thinking across this challenge, and that means different things for different teams, whether that's a sales partner, whether that's marketing, whether that's a dedicated growth team, whether that's something else. But it means that you're having a really cross-functional set of hands to think about this problem. And yeah, to your point, it meant a lot more collaboration. The people and the processes within it were definitely different.
Yeah, and so obviously those types of wins were only possible when the culture really shifted, from what I'm hearing then.
Yeah, that's right. I think without that, we would have been kind of all moving very fast on our different tracks, but not necessarily towards the right goals of saying, hey, what are we actually trying to move on that customer journey, on that customer kind of life cycle, and ultimately for that business outcome. We were all, very focused on, I've got 18 goals on these 21 business work days this month. I need to go work on those things. And so it left no time for thinking about, okay, where are we actually going? And
Yep.
are these the right things to be working on?
Yeah, and so obviously I'd have to assume then that things like executive sponsorship and leadership and buy-in is super critical here. So if I,
Yeah.
like, for example, if I'm a director of product and I'm trying to figure out how do I actually action this, how do you think about really getting that buy-in at the executive level? And like, how should I think about this in order to do this successfully?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to unpack here. I think that on the executive champion side, I think it's a critical part of the strategy to be able to say, not just to use your voice as whether you're a product director or something else, but to also say to get allies who have that kind of political power within the organization, because I don't want to use politics as with a negative connotation. This is a decision, like a group decision that needs to be made. You need to have allies to be able to kind of shift the culture and shift how the team thinks about it. And I think having that executive champion is very important here. And we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes about kind of what that culture of experimentation and excellence looks like and how to build towards it. But in terms of kind of finding that executive champion, it could be your head of product. If you're coming to this webinar, you might be frazzled. You might say like, okay, like that's actually, we don't as a product team have enough political power to improve the culture overall. So that might mean that it's an executive who is senior, and is connected to product outcomes. So that could be a go-to-market partner like sales or marketing leadership. I've definitely seen many partners in marketing because based on the kind of like shared language of growth across product and marketing, you have a very actionable set of outcomes that you can drive that lead to like healthy customer dynamics and healthy business dynamics. And so a lot of times those are phenomenal partners to have here. And ultimately, as we talk through kind of like the characteristics of a healthy culture of experimentation, we can also kind of talk about what are the steps to get there, right? Like, okay, if you are in this bad place, if you are in this kind of feature factory, what are the steps to get to the great way? Because like you can't just make a leap there.
Yeah, makes total sense. Because ultimately, like to your point, right? Culture is how teams actually act and collaborate with each other, not just the tech they use and things like that.
That's right. That's right. And so like this really boils down to three things. So first we're gonna talk about essentially here people, processes, and technology. So on the people side, I've already used the term squad here. I think it's very important to have this empowered, data-driven squad. That is the goal here, to be able to say, my team is empowered. That is to say, they are determining their destiny. They are owners of their strategy. They are informed by whether here they're driven by data, but they understand the customer and they're making those decisions. And again, that squad is cross-functional. That is not just a product team. And that set of people has ownership over the key business and customer problems, right? They are not, again, a laundry list. And if I've repeated that too many times, don't worry, we're going to get to how to shift from the laundry list to this goal state. That set of people has a set of processes, right? Like, and processes are not a bad thing. I'm not here lobbying for overly bureaucratic solutions. I'm lobbying for the healthy amount of communication that a team needs to be able to collaborate effectively and really grow this culture and grow towards the outcome driven work. So this means a couple things. One, like I said, healthy cross team communication, both within that squad of what the problem that they're tackling is, as well as outwards, both like laterally to other teams that are impacted, as well as upwards and downwards to kind of, does management know what's happening? Does management know that we're making progress on this experimentation, on this outcome, things like that? This also means, as a process, early integration of experimentation in product development, right? This is not a afterthought to say like, okay, we're shipping, what does success look like? Or we ship something, it got a lot of page views, a lot of eyeballs looked at it. Like that's not healthy, right? That's not necessarily, you don't know what a win looks like. So I think early integration of experimentation is part of the process. Early consideration of what is the hypothesis that we're testing, what is the test design about, what does a win look like, what does a loss look like, are we tracking data correctly, those success metrics, are they being kind of captured, and how am I implementing it? These are all part of the process part. And I think from a discussion perspective, this open discussion of wins, losses, insights, and future planning, like what are we going to do if this pans out this way? What are we going to do if it actually fails in another way? I think that thinking through that ahead of time is the sign of a really healthy team. Because if that's only happening afterwards, then you don't necessarily, you're doing it all post hoc. And then lastly, technology. You obviously need a robust platform to do your best work. You need to be able to kind of capture the product analytics as well as the multivariate testing. That's why we're absolutely here. We think that this is a phenomenal set of products here to do that. The technology is for sure a pillar here.
Yeah, makes total sense. But really, I think a lot of teams that I know I've spoken with sometimes approach it from technology first. And really, the way to get this really right and really drive that compounding value you mentioned before is to kind of hit all three of these in sequence, I would say. Is that fair to? Is that a fair characterization? Yeah.
Yeah, I think they build each over time. So you want to start the people, start the process, figure out the kind of potential technology solutions. Then these just kind of continue to build, because you'll find there are investments that need to be made in terms of like the people time that goes into this, in terms of the technology tools. So you want to kind of iterate towards that.
Yeah, makes total sense.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the characteristics of a culture of experimentation, and then also how to get there. This is, I think, the reason everyone's here, right? So let's talk about, okay, like I've talked about what bad looks like. We're going to talk a little bit about what good looks like, but really importantly, how to get there. The first one, we've already talked about this a little bit, is that executive sponsor. Securing an executive champion is really important. This helps you generate momentum, support risk-taking, and encourage learning from failures, because you will have failures and you don't want them to be perceived as showstoppers that we can no longer do this. That's a reason to not experiment. You want to see this as embracing failures. So we already talked about kind of finding someone who is senior in the organization. It could be your head of product, it could be your head of marketing, or another kind of go-to-market team that is highly connected to product outcomes, that is a partner and a thought partner on the data, things like that. Second is cultivating curiosity. So here we want to think about not just what we're shipping, but what are the gaps towards the outcomes that we're trying to drive, towards the customer behaviors that we're trying to drive. You need that curiosity to go beyond the laundry list, because you will have a lot of your mental space in that list, and you want to be able to think about what are we actually trying to drive towards, and how do we maximize those outcomes while actually minimizing our outputs, which is actually a lot of product managers are thinking about, okay, what am I building? What are the outputs? And what outcomes are they driving? We actually want to minimize our outputs for the given outcome. So I think that's a critical shift you need to make in your thinking about those outcomes. And then another part of this on cultivating curiosity is really just getting management hooked on results. This has been the number one most effective tip that I've given to teams, is to be able to start to get management tuned into what results you're shipping. And that doesn't need to necessarily be the future project, the next quarterly goal, the next yearly goal. This could be something that actually shipped last month, and you're like, hey, I actually just took a couple of hours to figure out what is the effect that had, and did we have a win from that? And you might not have currently the best tools. You might not have the best experimentation platform. And this might show some gaps in kind of what you're able to measure. But if you get management hooked on outcomes, first retrospective and then prospective, they get to start to think about, oh, this drove a win. It's not just about shipping an element. How can I do the next thing? Like next time I turn to Saleem and the product team, how do they provide a win for our business? So I think cultivating that curiosity around results is the biggest tip that I've given to teams, and has had the most outsized outcomes. Now, start small and then build out from there. I think that it's really important to not try to boil the ocean here. You are not going to do a full stack, complete experimentation, change everything, change our pricing, change our promotions, change our experience, turn features on and off, back end, front end, everything all at once. Really important to start small and build from there, because I think that you don't want to, bite off more than you can chew. So I think that it's important to build the people, the process, and the technology in an iteration format. I think it's important to have rigorous design principles here. We touched on this a little bit here, which is that you can't think about what success is after you've shipped something. You need to be thinking about, what is the hypothesis? Why are you building something? Why are you experimenting with your pricing? What are you trying to get out of it? What are you trying to learn out of it? What does a win look like? Doing that ahead of time means that you're being thoughtful about the outcomes you're trying to drive, and means that you're not just kind of making it up post hoc, saying like, oh, actually, like, 80% of our customers saw this experience. We're like, okay, does that matter? Like, is that a good thing? We want to make sure that we're doing that ahead of time. Yeah, from big problems to small tests. This is kind of exactly the phase one thing that I was talking about, where a lot of teams have this big push, this phase one of this project that we're going to do, and they never get to phase two. You want to break down that phase one into something that's a lot smaller, right? You want to be able to say, what is the smallest experiment that I can test, the smallest thing that I can learn that would validate this project that we're working on, or that would tell us something new about it. So you really always want to get to things that are more and more granular, because it lets you learn quicker, it lets you ship quicker, and it lets you, again, just like kind of test and learn along the way. And then lastly, you want to make sure that you're trusting your metrics and measurement. I touched on this kind of when building out the retrospective outcomes a little bit, where if I did a project that ended this month, let me go back, just not to say this is your best practice forever, but as you're getting started, let me go back and see what outcomes it drove. And if you can do that with outcomes that matter, with measurements that matter, that's good. That means that you're tracking it right. You're building trust in your systems. If you find a gap, that means that you have an issue. And before you go and say, we need to make everything experiment-based, we need to make everything, better, you're able to kind of like start to patch these holes in your data taxonomy, in your data collection, things like that. So you need to be able to build that trust towards metrics and measurement. And that also comes with research, with figuring out where the holes are and where you need to build from.
Awesome. And with that, we got some really great questions in the Q&A here. So let me address those. So let's see here. So Serge asks, is there a situation where a feature factory is justified if it's pursued in meeting competitive parity, while features may not deliver consumer customer value necessarily? What are your thoughts there?
So if I understand correctly, Serge, it's you're asking like when a competitor has features, we need to go match that. Does that justify it? Is that fair, Phil?
I think that's my interpretation of the question as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say like okay, so two things here. I think that first, you don't need to have every feature that a competitor has, right? Being competitor focused on what are we building is not going to get you anywhere. Best case scenario, you are always behind your competitors. Worst case scenario, you have followed them off a cliff, and they've learned the data from this experiment, and you did not learn because you just kind of fast followed their build. So number one, I want to remind everyone that like your customers may be different than your competitors' customers in some interesting way. That means that you have an advantage on what you should be building yourself. Now, let's say you're totally right. Customers look at features, and sometimes a competitor has a feature that you don't have, and there is a defensive play to be done here. That's totally valid. Sometimes in product, you're making offensive plays, sometimes defensive plays that just need to have parity. There's a good blog post by my Reforge peer, Eli Lerner, on offensive versus defensive plays. If you're making a defensive play here, I think that's valid. I think that's also a decision that should be made by that empowered product team. That doesn't mean you suddenly, give up all decision making here and now you're in a feature factory for the next, forever. That is a specific use case where you're able to make the decision to go for that. But that doesn't feel like that's a forever thing, or should be so long, or should be like the new norm.
Yeah, as someone who focuses a lot on RFPs, I definitely have been in that scenario before where there's certain features that can feel like checkbox items, especially if they're common in evaluations. So that makes a ton of sense from my experience.
Yeah, I don't want to be too idealistic and just say like, no, you don't need to worry about what your competitors have. Yes, you can think about what your competitors are doing. Yes, you can think about where you need parity, especially if your customers are telling you that like, oh, you don't have that, but the competitor does. Then you need to make a defensive play.
Yeah, it makes sense. And Skylar asks as a follow-up, could you answer the product parity question from the lens of replacing an existing legacy product, i.e. like product modernization?
Okay, so Skylar, it sounds like here it's around, I have a current generation of a product, I have a new generation. Where do I need to have parity? Where can I allow a gap? This is definitely a situation that I've faced both in my career and advising. I think similar to a lot of product decisions, you need to understand kind of like the severity of the customer problem here. So I think that there are trade-offs that you're going to make about having that feature that are maybe a little invisible to customers. And that invisible characteristic is time. How quickly can I get a simpler product in market? And how can I test that out without having every single feature? Because every single feature not only comes with individual kind of unit testing, but grows the complexity of the overall product. And so I think it's really important to judge the severity of the customer pain as they, you can do surveys like asking around how disappointed would you be if this feature did not exist? How disappointed would you be if that feature did not exist? This is breaking out not just an overall product NPS, but is actually thinking about the pain of each feature being missing. That's one part. The second part is obviously using things like product analytics to see, is there a certain type of account, certain type of customer that is using that feature? If it's everyone, that might be something that you need to have parity on, that you need to have for the next thing. You do need to build that. But if it's certain parts of your customer base, you can now think more creatively about, how do I carve this out? Do they get a dual experience? Do I ship, this experience to other customer base, but leave that type of customer or that set of customers on the old experience? This lets you somehow get something into market to test with a simpler, faster product. Without reaching 100% feature parity.
Makes sense. Another question we had, how do you influence this culture of experimentation to a stubborn higher up manager or managers?
Yeah. Well, as I said, I had 20 monthly goals for 20 business days. So I think I've done that with mixed results, right? Like I don't think I was able to kind of say like, okay, this is a completely new world here. I think it takes time. I think that with a stubborn boss, I feel like I'm like kind of like the product therapist here, right? Or like, how do I work with my manager? I think it's important. This is almost like just really just about communication. It's like it's important for them to feel and understand your pain here. That like you've got this laundry list, right? Like that you're wanted to do, and here's why you don't think it's always the best idea, right? Here's the opportunity that we think that we're dropping, and does this, this is the current kind of thing that we're going to do on this laundry list. When does this end? Because like I said, laundry lists never end. You always just get new
Right.
things on the list. And so the answer might be a negotiation here, which is like, listen, for the next month, we really need to get to this release, and then we can think a little bit more open-ended. That might be a good win here compared to like for the next year, you're now building on these features. But you need to kind of, I think, communicate a little bit about what the missed opportunity is. And then in addition, I would start to do some of the things that I talked about around how do I look at retrospective outcomes, what are the wins that have been had, try to get them addicted to those initial initial kind of set of like business outcomes, as opposed to like, yes, I completed the laundry list.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's super interesting because like I know that's the question that I usually ask because as the product marketer, like I can influence things to a certain degree, but the question I always ask is, what's the opportunity cost of building this? Like, what three
Yeah.
features am I giving up? Not just like, is this a good idea? I tend to try to make them articulate like, what do we miss if we do go full steam ahead on this decision?
Yeah, I think that's totally true. It does also remind me of one other beneficial tactic here that might be a related one. It might not be the exact question posed here, but a lot of times I get asked, Saleem, I have this list of things that my manager, that management wants me to do, but I don't see the strategy. We talk about, I run a Reforge program on product strategy. I talk about product strategy a lot, and they say we don't have a product strategy. We have kind of like just these things I need to go do. So what do I do? And it's kind of it is difficult to just go to some executive and say like, what's our strategy? Like what do we do? And that often has mixed success. I think there's a communication element here, which is like, I need more strategic guidance. Here's what I need from management. I think that's totally valid. And I think you should do that. But what I want to advise here is when you have these 10, 12 things to do, I think you as the product manager or designer or whatever should now take on like, how can I build a draft product strategy? Like, what do I see happening here? What do I see not happening here? How would I interpret this product strategy if this is all I knew? Because it is all you know. You only have that laundry list. So I think if you can make that draft of product strategy and you can go back to your manager and you can say, listen, here's the things that you're asking me to do. Here's my understanding of what winning looks like. It means that like these three things are our priorities. These three things are not our priorities. This is how we're going to win. This is what winning looks like. Let him or her, let them respond to that. Let them say, yes, this is exactly right. Yes, this is your strategy. Now, again, like that might not be the case. You're not gonna get it at 100%, especially if it's not known. But that at
Yep.
least gives you a straw man to respond to say like, thank you for coming. Like best case scenario, it's like, thank you for bringing this to me. Here's where I think you're on the right track. Here's actually where I think that this is not part of our strategy. And now you've learned something about your priorities. You've learned something about what's important to your manager about moving the needle.
Yeah, it makes total sense. A couple related ones. On the journey from feature factory culture to a value-driven outcome culture of experimentation, how are you iterating on the design of the culture? For instance, do you introduce one small experiment that proves the value evolving away from the feature factory? I imagine management will not just want to flip the switch. What can you share about and how to navigate that journey? And relatedly, how long does it typically take to move from one to the other, from the feature factory to the culture of experimentation?
So sorry, I had some camera issues for a second,
Oh,
but it
okay.
sounds
Yeah.
like how long is that does that transition take? And
Yeah.
what was the other part of it?
Yeah. And like, how do you actually iterate on the design of the culture, right? Like, what does that process look like? Do you do a small test and then kind of grow it that way? Or what does that look like? They were kind of related. So I sort of merged
Yeah,
them
totally.
together. Yeah.
Totally. So let's start with the second part of that question around like, where do you start? I think that there is a lot of commonality in building out a culture of experimentation and building out things like growth teams or growth practices within a company. A lot of times because those things kind of go hand in hand. We are data driven. We're talking about our outcomes. We're moving business outcomes and we're experimenting towards it. So there's a lot of commonality here. So my advice in both of these situations is not to boil the ocean. You want to start with a specific customer problem, a specific part of the customer journey, a specific product area of the team, and go and learn, go and figure out what works well and what doesn't work well. In terms of where to start, you probably need a willing product manager. That might be you on the call. You might need a willing and kind of capable engineering partner and team on like a system that can be measured. So a lot of times like platform teams are trying to just get to kind of from their laundry list to something that that drives business outcomes. It's even harder to get from there to A/B testing with a platform team. So a platform team might not be the right place to start here, but your customer sign-up flow, something front end, facing here, where you have a clear win-loss outcome, might be something that works well here. So I would start there. Start with one kind of unit of value of the customer journey, and then grow from there. That will give you lessons learned on the people, the processes, and the technology that you need. And then you can start to build out from there to other teams, to other parts of the customer journey. So that answers kind of like, how do I start? Where do I start? In terms of how long it takes, there's no one size fits all answer here, right? There are some startup teams that are trying to adopt this culture. They will hopefully be more nimble in this. There are some large companies here where a win looks like basically adopting this across my product team or my product org, and with my kind of like direct line manager here. So that might be a win there, and that might take several quarters in a larger company.
Yeah.
And there are some, like, I don't want to kind of, sugarcoat it. There are some cultures that are a little too constrained, that are like, they are not rigid, and you don't have the flexibility to be able to or the power, frankly, to be able to shift that entire large company culture. And that is painful. And like, you should do what you can in your team to be able to kind of drive morale and drive outcomes. But ultimately, like, find if it's a place, think about your values, about what do you value in your work. And if you want to be in a place that has that different culture, that can be part of your kind of calculus as well.
That makes sense. A couple more. How did you get engineering to align on being organized around outcome-based squads? Engineering is typically organized around outputs, platforms, and shared services, etc.
Yeah. So a couple things. One, idealistic, like just from an ideology perspective, no one wants to kind of run around with their head cut off, right? So engineering partners I've always found, have been very willing to say, like, how can we make this work? Because yes, there are definitely legit, like, technical challenges of like, I have this kind of expertise in this team, I have this different kind of code base and expertise somewhere else. But ultimately, like, you should get to step one, which is like, do we identify the problem? Do we agree on kind of like what a magical future looks like, where we're only focused on kind of those outcomes?
Yeah.
From there, it's about, how do you start to slice and dice it? I would say in both product, and certainly in product and sometimes in engineering, I like to think about what is the most complex dimension of the problem that the product manager is solving. So I don't necessarily want an iOS product manager. I want someone understanding kind of, maybe not even the mobile experience, but like, for example, in one place I worked, we had multiple brands that were all subscription. And so was it more interesting to have a product manager for each brand? No, because brands had maybe 20% of the visual design was different and the look and feel was different, but a lot of the information architecture and the product bones were the same. So really the challenges that they were facing were around customer journey, were around platform and technology, were around kind of internationalization. These were the kind of more interesting and complex dimensions by which the product team needed to be arranged. On the engineering side, to the kind of commentator's question, sometimes you might have an iOS and Android code base. So in this case, my advice would be to think about how you can create squads that may flex over time, that solve the customer that solve the customer problem that you're currently facing. And that doesn't mean that you're facing for this week. That means that you're currently facing for this quarter, multiple quarters up to the year, where you are trying to drive, for example, onboarding and activation. Who is the squad that's going to work on onboarding and activation? And what are the tools that they need, including the engineers that they need, to go be successful at that? And that might mean that that squad has a technical leader that is not the direct manager of that engineer on the squad. And that can be okay if you kind of figure out how these teams work, because then you'll have some responsibilities of the squad technical leader that figures out the architecture, that figures out kind of supporting the engineer on that project. And then you have their kind of career manager who's working with them kind of more long-term outside of the project itself, but on their just overall growth and development. So this is how you decouple the kind of technical code base from the squad that's solving the problem.
Got it. And then based on your experience, for our friends in product design, what's their role in the experimentation process?
Their role is a very good one. There's a good question. So I think there's a couple of things here. The first is about how we bring kind of like the product problems to life in design. Like, what are the potential, like, what is the problem space that we're thinking through? And then what are the potential solutions? I think sometimes when working with some design teams say, like, here's what we should be doing, like, here's the exact thing that we should do. And the rest of it is kind of an iceberg under the water around like the other alternatives that we're doing, the steps that got us to that solution and ruled out other things, and what we think what are the learnings that we're putting in place to kind of adopt solution A and rule out solutions B and C. I think in an experimentation culture, this will change over time depending on kind of like how you're experimenting, where you're experimenting. Part of that could be trying out, building out recommendation A as well as B, and seeing that against the control of the current thing, of the current experience. So part of the design kind of partnership here is being able to be a thought partner on what are we building? How can we make this a multivariate test if we want to learn? Is there something else to learn here? And it lets us kind of, without 100% confidence in the exact right solution, take on additional parts here. The second thing is really just thinking in a more modular way. I think that both for product design and engineering here, you're going to be kind of not just changing copy and not just changing the color of a button, right? Like, your goal here is changing meaningful parts of the customer journey. And so I think design as a thoughtful partner here is thinking about what do the different customer states look like? How can I make this, seamless for both customers as well as my partners in engineering and product? Because there's going to be times that things don't appear and aren't part of the customer journey, are not part of the customer experience. And so you're looking for a thoughtful partner that knows that this is a kind of branching and becoming different experiences.
Yep. And last one for you, Saleem, can you talk a little more about the staff journey for changing internal culture? How to best approach communication, messaging, incentivization, top down, bottom up, et cetera?
Yeah. I think that what are your thoughts here, Phil, from staff journey? As this means like not from a position of leadership, but rather from like PMs on the team, things like that, or what is the?
I think it could be from the executive side too. Like my sense from the question is that there's a lot of teams out there that just think the feature factory is the way, right? And so if whether you're a leader or not, trying to, and I think you talked about it before, that there may be places in cultures where like it can't change necessarily. But if you were going to start, like, what's the right approach to kind of start to change the conversation? And I think you talked about it a little bit, right?
Yeah.
It's starting small and then like compounding those wins out, I think is part of it. But I'm curious, like the messaging piece is an interesting one. Like if you're advising a company or like, leading a product org, and you walk into a culture that is a little bit broken, like what are the ways that you handle that communication and messaging layer to try to help get to the right outcome eventually?
Yeah, it's a good question. So step one, I will say that Amplitude and I are coming out with a blog post on this topic. So you can direct the rest of the team to that blog post as it comes out.
Love that.
And we're going to be capturing a lot here. This is, always be marketing. The second and real answer here, and like to Phil's point, we touched on this a little bit about the kind of crawl, walk, run approach that we can bring to this, where you want to start to create new messaging, new artifacts around like your draft strategy, around your draft product brief, that you're not just kind of making a user story that ships this feature, but like you're actually solving this customer problem. So drafting out those documents, even if they're not normally consumed by the team is one part of this. Starting small within a small team, breaking down phase ones is another part of it. Thinking about how to measure, thinking about retrospective outcomes and getting management hooked on initial outcomes. This is another part of it. Like there are all of these things that need to have a crawl element of it before you get to the walk, before you get to the run. And I think that's like the most meta thing here, that you need to have a test and learn culture to build the test and learn culture. But it is very much how you build towards success, because to the question here, Charles, like you can't jump into it 0 to 1. This has to be something that is built over time.
I think that's a pretty awesome summary of our conversation today. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us for this conversation. And Saleem, thank you so much for you sharing your expertise with the rest of the group here. As I said at the top of this webinar, you all will be receiving this recording. Thank you so much for joining, and have a good rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.